proposed agenda for action that we need to be engaged in. The encounter was as follows. Some 6 years ago, on the occasion then of the 60th anniversary of the Genocide Convention, I was invited to give a presentation on the 60th anniversary of the Genocide Convention. What have we learned? What must we do? The audience in Quebec was some 400, mostly Francophone lawyers, mostly non-Jewish. And as I concluded my presentation and sat down, a woman got up and she said, you know, Professor Cotler, as you know, I'm a lawyer. I was a lawyer in the Department of Justice when you were Minister of Justice. And there was something I always wanted to ask you, but tonight your presentation gives me the occasion to do so. You spoke about the 6 great lessons of the last 60 years. You can just say, now we just had the 66th anniversary of the Genocide Convention, and fast forward it still applies. You spoke about the 6 great lessons of the last 60 years. But in your comments, you didn't mention a word about Palestinian suffering. You didn't mention a word about the Nakba, the catastrophe to the Palestinian people. Can you tell us why you didn't talk at all about Palestinian suffering? Why you didn't reference at all the Palestinian Nakba? And I got up and I said as follows. I said, you're right, the Palestinians have suffered and they continue to suffer. I said, you're right, there was a Nakba, a catastrophe to the Palestinian people. I said, but what is it that happened 60 years ago? You can say now 66 years ago because it still follows. I said, 60 years ago, the United Nations adopted a partition resolution mandating the partition of then mandatory Palestine into 2 states, a Jewish state and an Arab state. In fact, I said the UN General Assembly referred to the Jewish state some 30 times in its resolution at the time. I said that the Jewish leadership accepted the partition resolution. I said the Arab leadership and Palestinian leadership did not. I said, mind you, they had a right to reject the resolution if they felt that it did not comport with their interests and aspirations. But what they didn't have a right to do was to then launch a war of aggression against the nascent Jewish state, which they spoke, not me, including in UN proceedings, as a war of extermination against the nascent Jewish state of Israel. And what they didn't have a right to do was to then launch another war of aggression against their own Jewish citizens living in Arab countries, disenfranchising them from their citizenship, dispossessing them from their rights, arresting them, detaining them, torturing them, expelling them. So at the end of these 2 acts of aggression, you had 2 sets of refugees, Palestinian Arab refugees and Jewish refugees from Arab countries. I said it's a tragedy to think that if the Arab leadership at the time had indeed accepted the UN partition resolution, we today would be commemorating the 60th anniversary, 66th anniversary of 2 states for 2 peoples, and avoided all the pain and suffering of these last 60 years. And then I said that, and then she got up, and this is the point of me telling you the story of this encounter. She got up and said, I have to tell you, I'm a lawyer, as I mentioned, as you know, I was a lawyer in the Department of Justice, still am. I consider myself a reasonably well-informed person. I follow public affairs very closely. This is the first I've ever heard about Jewish refugees from Arab countries. I've heard, of course, about Palestinian Arab refugees, but I always thought that this was the result of Jewish ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. She said, I still see, yes, there was a Nakba to the Palestinians, but there was also a Nakba to the Jews. There was, if I may put it, a double Nakba. But more importantly, as she put it, as a lawyer, she says, it appears that the responsibility lies with the Arab governments at the time for this double Nakba. And I then wrote an article, and several since, about this double Nakba. I mention this because while amongst us, in this audience, we would take the notion of the plain pain and plight of Jewish refugees from Arab countries as a given, most non-Jews do not know. And I have to tell you, as my experience has been, many Jews do not know about the pain and plight of Jewish refugees, wouldn't you say, from the Middle East, not just Arab countries. One would include Iran in that regard. And, of course, may not know about the rich history and heritage and civilization as exemplified in that of Babylonian Jewry, its history and heritage. And this revisionist Mid-East narrative, which effectively prejudices authentic reconciliation between peoples, let alone, two states for two peoples. This distorted narrative continues as we meet. In the last 2 months alone, the United Nations held yet again its annual Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. I've been there, I've seen the exhibit, I've seen what happens to people who witness that exhibit, where all they will see is exactly what the woman lawyer said to me. There was only one refugee population. You would not know that there had been any Jewish refugees from Arab countries. The United Nations General Assembly adopted yet again another resolution with respect to Palestinian Arab refugees. We now have over 170 resolutions by the United Nations General Assembly referencing Palestinian Arab refugees. Not one resolution ever in the history of the UN General Assembly referencing Jewish refugees from Arab countries. The United Nations Human Rights Council, regarded as the repository with respect to the promotion and protection of human rights on the UN and international human rights agenda, whose jurisprudence is taught in law schools, has yet to address the question of Jewish refugees from Arab countries. And for the first time ever, and this is not yet, unfortunately, as well known as it needs to be, the United Nations General Assembly has declared 2014 to be the year of solidarity with the Palestinian people. Not just one day, which was commemorated all the time on November 29th, but now the whole of 2014. And vested the chair for the 2014 year of solidarity with the United Nations Division on the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian people, which makes no reference ever to any of the rights of the Jewish people or Jewish people from Arab countries. And so the question then, and with this I close, is what is it that we must do? As it happens, while these events were taking place, a former Prime Minister, Canadian Prime Minister, Paul Martin, in whose government I had the pleasure and privilege to serve, said recently that the time has come to restore the pain and plight of Jewish refugees to the international peace and justice agenda from which it has been expunged these past 66 years. And I think that must be our first objective, because justice that continues to be delayed will be justice that continues to be denied. And so our first objective must be to restore the pain and plight and history and heritage of Jewish refugees from Arab countries to the international peace and justice narrative from which it has been expunged these past 66 years. And within that, to call upon the United Nations to establish a research and documentation center with respect to giving expression to that rich history and heritage and corresponding forced, not only forgotten exodus, but in fact forced exodus. Second thing is that we need at this point to provide victims, which are remedies which are available to all refugee groups, including rights of remembrance, truth, justice, and redress, which are mandated under international human rights and humanitarian law for all refugee groups. It now must be invoked for Jews displaced from Arab countries. Third, in the matter of duties and responsibilities, as this woman lawyer put it in that encounter I had in Quebec, each of the Arab countries and the Arab League must acknowledge their own role, their own responsibility in the double aggression that I mentioned of launching an aggressive war against the nation Jewish state and launching, in effect, a war against their own Jewish nationals. You know, a study that some of us made some 6 years ago and published it at the time. My colleague David Amadis and Stan Irwin, who's the Executive Director of Justice for Jews from Arab countries, we found that there was a secret legislative initiative calling upon all Arab countries to engage in all the disenfranchisement of rights and dispossessions, etc., that I mentioned, including the enactment of Nuremberg race laws. The time does not permit me to go into, but it is a story that has not been told. Is it a story that needs to be told, and it is a truth that must finally be exposed. Fourth, the Arab League, and one speaks increasingly about the Arab League and its declaration. It should incorporate the question of Jewish refugees from Arab countries as part of its framework for an Israeli-Arab peace, in the same way that the Jewish narrative incorporates that of Palestinian refugees in its vision of an Israeli-Arab peace. Fifth, at the international level, every agency of the UN, be it the UN General Assembly, the United Nations Council on Human Rights, etc., has to give expression to this importance of truth and justice. Sixth, the annual November 29th commemoration, and in particular now, the 2014 Year of Declaration of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, must be an annual day and now a year of solidarity with the Jewish people as well as with the Palestinian people. And if the UN is not going to do it, then the Jewish people, in conjunction with men and women of goodwill and countries of goodwill, must launch our own year of truth and justice and solidarity with respect to Jewish people from Arab countries, as well as both their history and heritage and their plight and pain. Seventh, jurisdiction over Palestinian refugees should be transferred from UNRWA, which frankly continues to engage in ongoing patterns of incitement against Israel and in misrepresentations of the truth. It should be transferred to the United Nations Commissioner for Refugees. There's no reason why there should be one separate, and why there has been one separate body dealing with Palestinian refugees, whereas all other refugees in the world are under the jurisdiction of the United Nations Commissioner for Refugees, which is where Palestinian refugees also belong. And finally, in any and all discussions between the negotiating parties, any reference to Palestinian refugees must always include express reference to Jewish refugees. Otherwise, we will continue to engage in a misrepresentation of truth and justice. And I just want to say, with regard to Israel, while we are calling upon other governments and parliaments to engage in a kind of global advocacy exercise with respect to restoring the truth and justice of Jewish refugees from Arab countries to the international peace and justice narrative, that story must also come out of Israel. The Israeli government, the Israeli parliament, the Israeli people must also be engaged and be at the forefront of this advocacy effort. In a word, and to close, if there will be no remembrance, there will be no truth. If there will be no truth, there will be no justice.